The emergency radio crackled to life at 2:47 a.m., cutting through the silence of the Cascade Mountain Rescue Station. We have 5 hikers missing in the Devil's Canyon area. The last known position was the North Ridge Trail. The weather's turning bad fast. What nobody knew was that one woman's wrong compass reading was about to become the difference between life and death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell had been leading wilderness expeditions for 8 years, but she'd never dealt with a group quite like this one. The corporate retreat participants from Henderson Tech Solutions had signed up for what their HR department called a team-building adventure in Washington's Olympic Peninsula. What they got was a crash course in why you don't ignore your guide's instructions. The trouble started on day 2 of their 5-day backcountry trek. The original plan was straightforward. Follow the established Elk Ridge Trail through the temperate rainforest, camp at designated spots, and emerge at Lake Crescent feeling accomplished and bonded as a team. Sarah had run this exact route dozens of times. She knew every switchback, every creek crossing, every potential hazard. The group consisted of 5 mid-level managers, all in their 30s and 40s, all convinced that their problem-solving skills from the office would translate seamlessly to the wilderness. There was Marcus Thompson, the VP of Operations, who treated every decision like a board meeting. Jennifer Walsh, the marketing director, who hadn't stopped checking her dead phone since they'd lost cell service. David Chen from IT, who kept questioning why they couldn't just use GPS like normal people. Patricia Rodriguez from accounting, who had brought enough energy bars to feed a small army but complained about every uphill section. And finally, Robert Kim from Human Resources, who seemed more interested in documenting everything with his waterproof camera than actually participating. Sarah had dealt with corporate groups before. They typically fell into 2 categories: the ones who embraced the experience and discovered something new about themselves, and the ones who spent the entire time wishing they were back in their climate-controlled offices. This group was trending toward the latter, but she'd managed to keep spirits reasonably high through the first day and a half. That morning, Sarah had noticed something troubling during her pre-dawn weather check. The barometric pressure was dropping faster than her instruments had shown the night before. The wind patterns were shifting in a way that suggested a significant weather system was approaching from the Pacific, potentially bringing the kind of sudden, violent storms that could turn a routine hike into a survival situation. She'd been monitoring conditions since 4 a.m., cross-referencing her portable weather radio with her own observations of cloud formations, wind direction changes, and the behavior of local wildlife. The ravens had been acting agitated since sunrise, and she'd noticed the usual morning chorus of songbirds was absent. These weren't the kind of details that made it into weather reports, but they were the signs that experienced guides learned to read after years in the mountains. During breakfast, Sarah made her decision. Instead of following the planned route along the exposed ridgeline, they needed to take the lower valley trail. It would add almost 6 miles to their journey and put them behind schedule, but it would keep them in sheltered terrain when the weather hit. "Change of plans," Sarah announced as the group finished their instant oatmeal and camp coffee. "We're taking the Whitewater Valley route instead of staying on the ridge." Marcus looked up from his topographic map, frowning. "That's not what we discussed in the pre-trip briefing. The valley route isn't even on our itinerary." "I know," said, pointing to her compass and then to the darkening clouds on the western horizon. "But the weather's shifting faster than predicted. The ridge trail will be fully exposed when the system comes through." Jennifer shook her head. "The forecast we saw before we left civilization said clear skies for the next 3 days. You're reading your compass wrong if you think we need to go down into that valley. We'll lose half a day." "My compass reading is fine," replied patiently, "but weather forecasts can change quickly out here. Those clouds weren't supposed to be there, and that wind shift happened 6 hours ahead of schedule." David pulled out his own compass, an expensive digital model he'd bought specifically for this trip. "My compass shows the ridge trail heading northeast, just like the map says. If we go into the valley, we're heading northwest. That's literally the opposite direction from our destination." Sarah tried to explain that sometimes the safest route isn't the most direct one, but she could see she was losing them. These were people accustomed to straight lines, to efficiency, to taking the shortest path between 2 points. The concept of deliberately choosing a longer, seemingly unnecessary detour didn't compute with their business-minded approach to problem solving. Patricia voiced what the others were thinking. "Look, no offense, but we're paying good money for this experience. We signed up for the Ridge Trail adventure, not a forced march through some swampy valley. Can't we just move faster and beat the weather?" Robert, ever the HR professional, tried to find a diplomatic middle ground. "Maybe we could put it to a group vote, democratic decision-making and all that." Sarah felt the familiar frustration that came with guiding people who confused having opinions with having expertise. "This is not a democracy," she said firmly. "This is wilderness safety. I'm responsible for getting all of you home alive, and that means sometimes making unpopular decisions." But Marcus was already rallying the group around his interpretation of the situation. "Here's what I see happening. Our guide is either misreading her equipment or she's being overly cautious to the point where it's affecting our experience. We checked multiple weather sources before this trip. We have backup gear. We're all reasonably fit adults." Jennifer added, "I mean, look around. It's partly cloudy at worst. Those clouds don't look particularly threatening. Honestly, Sarah, it feels like you're manufacturing drama where none exists." Robert, ever the HR professional, tried to find a diplomatic middle ground. "Maybe we could put it to a group vote, democratic decision-making and all that." Sarah felt the familiar frustration that came with guiding people who confused having opinions with having expertise. "This is not a democracy," she said firmly. "This is wilderness safety. I'm responsible for getting all of you home alive, and that means sometimes making unpopular decisions." But Marcus was already rallying the group around his interpretation of the situation. "Here's what I see happening. Our guide is either misreading her equipment or she's being overly cautious to the point where it's affecting our experience. We checked multiple weather sources before this trip. We have backup gear. We're all reasonably fit adults." Jennifer added, "I mean, look around. It's partly cloudy at worst. Those clouds don't look particularly threatening. Honestly, Sarah, it feels like you're manufacturing drama where none exists." Sarah looked at her compass one more time, then at the subtle signs that her years of experience had taught her to recognize. The air pressure felt different against her eardrums. The quality of light had that particular gray undertone that preceded serious weather. Even the insects had gone quiet. She made one final attempt. "I understand your concerns, but I need you to trust my judgment here. I've been guiding in this area for nearly a decade. I've seen weather systems develop that weren't in any forecast. The valley route keeps us below the tree line and near fresh water sources if we need to shelter unexpectedly." David shook his head. "Your compass is clearly malfunctioning if you think northwest is the right direction. We need to go northeast to reach our pickup point. This is basic navigation." "We can make up the time tomorrow if we push a little harder," Marcus added. "But we're not going to let compass problems derail the entire expedition." The group had made up their collective mind. Sarah realized that forcing them to follow her route would create more problems than it solved. Reluctantly, she agreed to continue with the original Ridge Trail plan, but insisted on additional safety precautions. Everyone would carry extra water, they'd check in every 30 minutes, and at the first sign of dangerous weather, they would immediately seek shelter regardless of location. As they packed up camp and prepared to head up toward the ridge, Sarah took one last look at her compass. The needle pointed steadily northwest toward the valley trail, just as it had all morning. She wasn't wrong about the direction, and she wasn't wrong about the weather. But sometimes being right didn't matter if nobody would listen. The irony wasn't lost on her that a group of managers who made their living analyzing data and making strategic decisions had just voted to ignore the professional judgment of someone with significantly more relevant experience. But that was a problem for later reflection. Right now, she had to focus on keeping them all safe on a route that every instinct told her was a mistake. As they started up the trail toward the ridge, the first drops of rain began to fall. The rain started as a gentle mist, the kind that Pacific Northwest locals barely notice. But Sarah's stomach tightened as she felt the temperature drop 3 degrees in the span of 10 minutes. She'd experienced enough mountain weather to know that gentle beginnings often led to violent conclusions. "Just a light drizzle," Marcus called out from behind her, his voice carrying that particular tone of vindication. "Good thing we didn't overreact and head into that valley for nothing." Sarah adjusted her pack straps and kept moving. The ridge trail climbed steadily through old-growth Douglas fir and western hemlock, their massive trunks providing some shelter from the increasing precipitation. But as they gained elevation, the forest would thin out, leaving them exposed on the rocky spine that connected 3 separate peaks. 20 minutes into their ascent, Jennifer slipped on a moss-covered root. She caught herself against a tree trunk, but not before twisting her left ankle. "It's fine," she said quickly, noting Sarah's concerned expression. "Just a minor stumble." But Sarah noticed Jennifer's slight limp as they continued climbing. She also noticed that the light drizzle was transitioning into actual rain, and the wind was starting to pick up. The trees around them began to sway with increasing intensity. David, who had been checking his digital compass obsessively, stopped abruptly. "This is weird," he said, staring at the device. "My reading keeps fluctuating. First it showed northeast, now it's showing north-northwest, now it's back to northeast." "Electronic equipment can be unreliable in changing weather," Sarah said, pulling out her traditional magnetic compass. The needle held steady, pointing toward the valley route she wanted to take. Patricia, who had been relatively quiet during the morning's disagreement, was starting to look genuinely concerned. "How much farther to the ridgeline?" she asked. "About 45 minutes at our current pace," Sarah replied. "But we might want to consider—" "We're not turning back," Marcus interrupted. "We've already invested an hour in this route. Turning around now would put us even further behind schedule." Robert, who had been documenting their journey with his waterproof camera, paused his filming to wipe rain from the lens. "The weather definitely seems to be picking up," he observed diplomatically. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Sarah made a mental calculation. They were approaching the point of no return. Soon, they would be closer to the ridgeline than to their starting point, making retreat more difficult than continuing forward. But every fiber of her professional experience was screaming that they should turn around. The rain intensified suddenly, shifting from steady drops to driving sheets. Visibility dropped to maybe 30 yards. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze an hour earlier, was now strong enough to require conscious effort to maintain balance on the increasingly slippery trail. "Okay, this is getting a little intense," Jennifer admitted, pulling her hood tighter around her face. Her ankle was clearly bothering her more than she'd initially let on, and the combination of rain and uneven terrain was making her progress noticeably slower. Sarah called for a brief rest under a large cedar tree that provided some shelter. She pulled out her weather radio and tried to get an updated forecast, but the static was too heavy to make out any clear information. The atmospheric interference was another bad sign. "How often do storms like this develop without warning?" David asked, having to raise his voice slightly over the sound of rain hitting the forest canopy above them. "More often than people think," Sarah replied. "The Olympic Peninsula creates its own weather patterns. Air masses coming off the Pacific hit these mountains and can intensify rapidly." Marcus checked his watch. "We can't afford to wait this out. We have pickup arrangements at Lake Crescent tomorrow afternoon. If we start falling behind schedule, it affects everyone's flight arrangements, hotel bookings, and the whole logistics chain." Sarah wanted to point out that missing flights was preferable to requiring emergency evacuation, but she could see the group's mindset hadn't shifted despite the deteriorating conditions. They were still thinking like business travelers dealing with minor inconveniences rather than wilderness travelers facing potentially dangerous weather. As they resumed hiking, the trail became increasingly treacherous. What had been solid earth an hour earlier was now a slippery mixture of mud, wet leaves, and loose rocks. The group's pace slowed considerably as everyone focused on not losing their footing on the steep sections. Patricia was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "This is getting pretty sketchy. Maybe we should have listened to Sarah about the valley route." But they were now 30 minutes past the last reasonable turnaround point. The Valley Trail junction was behind them, and the ridge line was still ahead. They were committed to their chosen path, whether they liked it or not. The temperature continued to drop. Sarah estimated they'd lost about 8 degrees since breaking camp, which meant they were dealing with a significant weather system, not just a passing shower. The rain was now coming down hard enough that their supposedly waterproof gear was beginning to show its limitations. Jennifer's jacket was clearly not as weatherproof as advertised, and she was starting to shiver. "How much longer to the ridge?" Robert asked, his earlier enthusiasm for documenting the adventure notably diminished. "Maybe 20 minutes if we can maintain our current pace," Sarah replied. "But the weather's going to be worse up there. We'll be completely exposed." David stopped again to check his compass, shaking it in frustration. "This thing is completely useless now. It keeps spinning between different readings." Sarah showed him her traditional compass. "Magnetic interference from the storm," she explained. "Electronic devices are more susceptible to atmospheric disturbances." As if to underscore her point, a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the forest around them, followed almost immediately by a crash of thunder that seemed to shake the ground beneath them. "Lightning," Marcus said unnecessarily. That's not good when we're heading for the highest point around." Sarah nodded grimly. "Lightning seeks the highest conductors. The ridgeline we're heading toward is exactly where you don't want to be during an electrical storm." The group stopped moving entirely. For the first time since the expedition began, they were truly listening to their guide's professional assessment of the situation. "What are our options?" Jennifer asked, water dripping from the brim of her cap. Sarah pulled out her topographic map, protecting it from the rain with her jacket. "We can try to find shelter here in the forest and wait it out, but we don't know how long this system will last. We can continue to the ridge and risk lightning exposure, or," she paused, tracing a route with her finger. "Or what?" Patricia prompted. "There's an emergency trail that cuts back toward the valley. It's not on most maps because it's maintained by the Forest Service for rescue access, but I know where it connects. It would get us off the ridge approach and into more sheltered terrain." Marcus looked skeptical. "How do we know this mystery trail actually exists, and how do we know it's safe?" "Because I've used it twice before in emergency situations. Once for a medical evacuation, once when lightning made the main trail too dangerous to continue." Another lightning flash, closer this time, followed by thunder that arrived just seconds later. The electrical activity was intensifying rapidly. "Lightning," Marcus said unnecessarily. That's not good when we're heading for the highest point around." Sarah nodded grimly. "Lightning seeks the highest conductors. The ridgeline we're heading toward is exactly where you don't want to be during an electrical storm." The group stopped moving entirely. For the first time since the expedition began, they were truly listening to their guide's professional assessment of the situation. "What are our options?" Jennifer asked, water dripping from the brim of her cap. Sarah pulled out her topographic map, protecting it from the rain with her jacket. "We can try to find shelter here in the forest and wait it out, but we don't know how long this system will last. We can continue to the ridge and risk lightning exposure, or," she paused, tracing a route with her finger. "Or what?" Patricia prompted. "There's an emergency trail that cuts back toward the valley. It's not on most maps because it's maintained by the Forest Service for rescue access, but I know where it connects. It would get us off the ridge approach and into more sheltered terrain." Marcus looked skeptical. "How do we know this mystery trail actually exists, and how do we know it's safe?" "Because I've used it twice before in emergency situations. Once for a medical evacuation, once when lightning made the main trail too dangerous to continue." Another lightning flash, closer this time, followed by thunder that arrived just seconds later. The electrical activity was intensifying rapidly. "The thing is," Sarah continued, "the trail junction is about 10 minutes behind us. We'd have to backtrack, which means admitting we chose the wrong route from the beginning." David wiped rain from his face. "At this point, I think admitting we were wrong is better than getting struck by lightning." Jennifer, who was now visibly shivering despite her efforts to stay warm, nodded emphatically. "I vote for not getting electrocuted." Robert had stopped filming entirely and was focused on keeping his equipment dry. "Whatever gets us out of this safely." Patricia looked at Marcus, waiting for the unofficial leader of their group to make the call. Marcus stared up at the storm-darkened canopy above them, listening to the increasing intensity of rain and wind. "Okay," he said finally. "Sarah, you're the expert. We should have listened to you from the beginning. Where's this emergency trail?" Sarah felt a mixture of relief and professional validation, though she kept her expression neutral. "Follow me. We need to move quickly but carefully. The trail will be slippery, and we want to get below the tree line before this electrical activity gets any worse." As they began retracing their steps, the storm continued to build around them. The wind was now strong enough to bend smaller trees visibly, and the lightning flashes were becoming frequent enough that they could navigate by the intermittent illumination. "Sarah," Patricia called out as they hurried down the muddy trail, "when you said we should take the valley route this morning, you knew this was coming, didn't you?" Sarah nodded, focusing on her footing on the treacherous surface. "Not exactly this, but something like it. Weather patterns, wildlife behavior, atmospheric pressure changes, there are signs if you know what to look for. And we ignored you because we thought your compass was wrong," David said, a note of embarrassment in his voice. "Compasses don't lie," Sarah replied, "but people sometimes don't trust what they're seeing when it contradicts what they want to believe." The emergency trail junction appeared ahead of them, marked by a barely visible Forest Service blaze on a large cedar tree. Sarah had been counting her steps to find it in the reduced visibility, and her navigation had been perfect despite the group's earlier doubts about her compass reading. "This way," she called out, pointing toward a narrow trail that angled away from the ridge approach and back toward lower elevations. "The trail drops into a drainage that feeds into the valley system. It'll be sheltered from the worst of the wind and will be well below the lightning risk." As they started down the emergency trail, following Sarah's steady compass bearing, the group began to understand just how wrong they'd been about more than just the weather forecast. Their guide hadn't been making navigation errors, she'd been trying to save their lives. And they were about to discover just how much danger they'd been in without realizing it. The emergency trail descended rapidly into a narrow ravine where towering evergreens formed a natural canopy that blocked most of the driving rain. The immediate relief from the storm's intensity was dramatic. The howling wind reduced to a manageable breeze, and the lightning that had been striking with terrifying frequency above them became distant flashes glimpsed through gaps in the forest cover. "This is incredible," Robert said, lowering his hood for the first time in an hour. "It's like we walked into a different climate zone." Sarah nodded as she checked her compass bearing. "Microclimates," she explained, while carefully navigating around a fallen log that blocked part of the trail. "These deep drainage areas create their own weather patterns. The tree cover and elevation change can make a difference of 15 or 20 degrees in temperature." Jennifer, whose ankle was still bothering her but seemed more manageable now that the trail was softer and less rocky, looked back toward where they'd come from. Through the trees, they could see lightning illuminating the ridgeline they'd been heading toward just 30 minutes ago. "Jesus," Marcus muttered, watching a particularly bright flash. "We would have been right up there in the middle of that." Patricia counted the seconds between lightning flash and thunder. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3. The thunder crashed around them. "That's less than a mile away." David pulled out his phone, which had been useless for communication, but still functioned as a basic tool. "I'm getting some weird readings on the barometric pressure app. It's dropped almost a full inch since this morning." "That's a significant pressure drop," Sarah confirmed, "the kind that usually accompanies major storm systems." This isn't just a typical Pacific Northwest rain shower. As they continued down the emergency trail, the group began to process how dramatically they'd misjudged the situation. The trail itself was well maintained despite being unmarked, with log bridges across creek crossings and switchbacks that kept the grade manageable even in wet conditions. "How did you know about this trail?" Jennifer asked, stepping carefully across a small stream that was running higher than normal due to the rainfall. "Emergency services training," Sarah replied. "All certified wilderness guides in this area are required to know alternate routes for medical evacuations and emergency extractions. This trail connects to an old logging road that Forest Service vehicles can access." Marcus, who had been unusually quiet since acknowledging his mistake, finally spoke up. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. We all do. When you said we should take the valley route, you weren't just being overcautious. You were trying to keep us out of exactly this kind of situation." Sarah paused to let the group catch up at a relatively flat section of trail. Weather prediction in mountainous terrain isn't an exact science, but experience teaches you to recognize patterns. The signs were all there this morning: atmospheric pressure, wind direction changes, wildlife behavior. "Wildlife behavior?" Robert asked, interested despite their circumstances. "Birds go quiet before major weather events. Ravens become agitated. Even insects change their activity patterns when atmospheric pressure drops significantly." Sarah pointed to a nearby tree where several small birds had taken shelter. "Notice how they're all hunkered down, facing away from the wind direction? They've been doing that since before dawn." Patricia looked around with new awareness. "I never would have noticed something like that." "Most people wouldn't," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "It's not intuitive knowledge. It comes from years of watching patterns and learning from other experienced guides and wilderness professionals." The trail continued to descend, following the natural contours of the drainage. The farther they moved from the ridgeline, the more apparent it became that they'd narrowly avoided a potentially catastrophic situation. Through occasional breaks in the tree cover, they could see the exposed rocky areas they would have been crossing just as the electrical activity reached its peak intensity. "So, when we accused you of reading your compass wrong," David said, clearly embarrassed, "you were actually trying to guide us away from this storm path." "The compass reading was never wrong," Sarah explained patiently. "I was pointing toward the valley route because that's where we needed to go for safety. The fact that it wasn't the most direct route to our planned destination was irrelevant compared to avoiding dangerous weather exposure." As they walked, Sarah began sharing more details about wilderness navigation and weather awareness that highlighted just how much specialized knowledge went into what the group had dismissed as simple direction finding. "Traditional navigation isn't just about reading a compass and following a bearing," she explained. "You have to factor in terrain features, seasonal weather patterns, escape routes, water sources, shelter availability. A straight line between 2 points might look efficient on a map, but it could lead you through avalanche zones, across unstable terrain, or into weather traps." The group listened with the kind of attention they should have paid that morning. They were beginning to understand that their business world problem-solving approach, identify objectives, find shortest path, execute efficiently, was not only inadequate for wilderness situations, but potentially dangerous. "The valley route I wanted to take this morning," Sarah continued, "would have kept us below the tree line all day. Multiple shelter options, fresh water access, established campsites if we needed to wait out bad weather. The trade-off was distance and time, but those become irrelevant if the direct route puts you in serious danger." Jennifer, whose earlier skepticism had completely evaporated, asked, "How often do you have to override clients' preferences for safety reasons?" "More often than you'd think," Sarah replied. "People who are successful in their professional lives often have confidence that doesn't necessarily translate to outdoor expertise. The hardest part of guiding isn't the technical skills, it's knowing when to insist on unpopular decisions." Marcus stopped walking for a moment, looking back toward the ridgeline where lightning was still flashing with alarming frequency. "We could have been killed up there, couldn't we?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. Lightning strikes on exposed ridges are statistically rare, but they do happen. More likely, we would have been dealing with hypothermia from exposure, potential injuries from slips on wet rock, or getting lost in reduced visibility. But yes, the lightning risk was real. The trail began to level out as they reached the bottom of the drainage. Here, the emergency trail intersected with a wider path that Sarah recognized as part of the valley route system she'd originally proposed. "This is where we would have been if we'd taken the valley route this morning," she announced, pointing to a trail marker that indicated multiple destinations. The group looked around at the sheltered valley floor, where mature trees provided excellent wind protection and the trail surface was well drained despite the heavy rainfall. Even in the current storm conditions, this area felt manageable and safe. "It's so much calmer here," Patricia observed. "The wind is barely noticeable." "Valley systems funnel wind in predictable ways," Sarah explained. "The surrounding ridges break up the worst of the turbulence. That's why traditional cultures often established settlements in valleys rather than on high ground, despite the advantages of elevation for defense." Robert, who had started filming again now that the emergency danger had passed, asked, "What's our plan now? Are we still trying to reach the original campsite?" Sarah consulted her topographic map, using a waterproof case to protect it from the continuing rain. "The campsite we were heading for is on the ridge system, which is obviously not accessible in current conditions. But there's an established site about 2 miles down this valley that has shelter structures and fresh water access." "Shelter structures?" David asked hopefully. "Three-sided lean-tos built by the Forest Service for emergency use. Not luxurious, but they'll keep us dry and allow us to set up our sleeping gear without exposing it to the rain." The group's relief was visible. The prospect of trying to set up tents in driving rain and lightning had been weighing on everyone's minds, though nobody had wanted to voice the concern. As they hiked toward the emergency shelter, Sarah continued to point out features of the landscape that demonstrated why the valley route had been the safer choice. Stable trail conditions, multiple creek crossings with good water quality, established campsites, and most importantly, protection from the worst of the mountain weather. "The ironic thing," Sarah said as they approached the shelter area, "is that we'll actually reach Lake Crescent ahead of schedule by taking this route. The valley trail system is longer in distance but faster to travel because the terrain is more forgiving." Marcus shook his head in amazement. "So not only were you trying to keep us safe, but your route would have been more efficient overall." "Experience teaches you that the shortest distance between 2 points is rarely the best path in wilderness conditions," Sarah replied. "Terrain, weather, safety margins, group capabilities, they all factor into route selection." The emergency shelter came into view through the trees, 3 solid wooden lean-tos positioned around a central fire ring, with a covered area for food preparation and gear storage. Despite the continuing storm, the site felt secure and welcoming. "This is fantastic," Jennifer said, visibly relieved at the prospect of getting properly dry and warm. As they began setting up their gear in the sheltered space, the group reflected on how completely their understanding of the situation had changed in just a few hours. What had started as confidence in their own judgment and skepticism about their guide's competence had transformed into appreciation for expertise they hadn't recognized. "Sarah," Patricia said as she unpacked her sleeping bag, "when we questioned your compass reading this morning, how frustrating was that for you?" Sarah smiled for the first time since the crisis began. "Honestly, pretty frustrating. But it's part of the job. My responsibility is to keep you safe, not to be right for the sake of being right. Sometimes that means letting people make mistakes they can learn from, as long as the consequences aren't too serious." "But this could have been serious," Robert pointed out. "Which is why I kept pushing for the valley route and insisted on the additional safety precautions when you chose the ridge trail," Sarah replied. "I couldn't force you to make the safer choice, but I could try to minimize the risks of the choice you did make." As the group settled into the shelter and began preparing a hot meal on their portable stoves, they realized that their guide's wrong compass reading had been exactly right all along. She hadn't been making navigation errors, she'd been navigating towards safety, while they'd been focused on efficiency and ego. The storm continued to rage above them, but in the protected valley, they were warm, dry, and secure. And they were beginning to understand that sometimes the person who seems to be pointing you in the wrong direction is actually the one trying to save your life. The storm raged through the night with an intensity that none of them had experienced before. From the safety of their emergency shelter, they could hear trees creaking and occasionally crashing in the distance, punctuated by thunder that seemed to shake the entire mountain. The lean-to structures, built from massive cedar logs and engineered to withstand decades of Pacific Northwest weather, held firm against the assault. Sarah woke several times throughout the night to check conditions and monitor the group. Around 3 a.m., she quietly slipped outside to assess the situation and was shocked by what she discovered. The small creek that had been running normally when they arrived was now a raging torrent, carrying debris from higher elevations. The trail they'd taken to reach the shelter was partially washed out in 2 places. More significantly, her emergency radio crackled to life with a Forest Service broadcast that made her blood run cold. Ridge Trail closure in effect for Olympic Peninsula Sector 7. Multiple lightning strikes have caused significant rockfall and trail damage. Emergency crews responding to injured hikers in exposed areas. All backcountry travelers should seek immediate shelter and avoid ridgeline travel until further notice. Sarah quietly documented the radio traffic in her logbook, noting the time and specific details. Sector 7 included the exact ridgeline her group had wanted to traverse. Other hikers had made the same mistake her clients had almost made, but without experienced guidance to redirect them to safety. By morning, the immediate fury of the storm had passed, but steady rain continued. Sarah emerged from her sleeping bag to find the corporate team already awake and discussing the night's events in hushed tones. The sound of the swollen creek and distant rockfall had kept most of them alert through the dark hours. "Did you hear that radio traffic around 3 a.m.?" Marcus asked quietly. Sarah nodded grimly. Ridge Trail closure due to lightning damage and rockfall. There were injuries reported in our original target area. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Jennifer broke the silence first. People were actually hurt on the route we wanted to take? Emergency evacuation was mentioned twice during the night, Sarah confirmed. I don't have details about the severity of injuries, but helicopter evacuations were required. David stared at his useless digital compass, which had completely stopped functioning during the electrical activity. We would have been right in the middle of that. Patricia began calculating timing in her head. If we'd stuck to the original plan, we would have been on that exposed ridge right when the worst lightning hit. Robert, who had been documenting their entire adventure, put down his camera. Sarah, you didn't just save us from getting wet and uncomfortable, you saved us from potentially serious injury or worse. Sarah began preparing coffee on her portable stove, using the routine of familiar tasks to process the magnitude of what had almost happened. Weather in mountainous terrain can escalate faster than most people realize. What looks like a manageable rain shower at lower elevations can become life-threatening conditions on exposed ridges. As they shared breakfast and listened to ongoing emergency radio traffic, the full scope of Sarah's expertise became apparent. She hadn't just been reading weather signs, she'd been conducting a complex risk assessment that factored in terrain, group capabilities, escape routes, and potential consequences that extended far beyond their immediate comfort. I need to ask you something, Marcus said, pouring hot coffee from the communal pot. Yesterday morning, when we overruled your recommendation, how certain were you that we were making a dangerous mistake? Sarah considered the question carefully. Certain enough that I documented my recommendation and your decision to override it in my incident log. Certain enough that I insisted on additional safety protocols. But weather prediction isn't absolute. There's always an element of probability rather than certainty. What would have happened if we'd refused to turn back when the lightning started? Jennifer asked. I would have used my emergency authority as the licensed guide to override group decisions, Sarah replied. At that point, safety protocols take precedence over client preferences. I'm legally responsible for your welfare, and that includes making unpopular decisions when necessary. David looked up from his now functional compass, which had mysteriously started working correctly again once the electrical interference passed. "So, you actually have the authority to force us to follow safety protocols?" "Every licensed wilderness guide does," Sarah confirmed. "It's part of the certification requirements. We're trained to recognize when group dynamics or individual overconfidence creates dangerous situations." The implications of this information settled over the group. They realized that Sarah had been balancing multiple competing pressures: their explicit preferences, their safety requirements, legal responsibilities, and professional judgment calls that could mean the difference between a successful trip and a tragic outcome. As the morning progressed, they began breaking down their temporary camp and preparing for the modified route to Lake Crescent. The Valley Trail system that Sarah had originally recommended was not only passable, but in excellent condition despite the storm. The contrast with conditions on the Ridge Trail, which remained closed due to ongoing rockfall danger, was stark. "The really amazing part," Patricia observed as they packed their gear, "is that taking your recommended route would have gotten us to our destination faster and safer. We spent all that time arguing about efficiency when you were offering us the most efficient option." Sarah smiled as she secured her pack. "Experience teaches you that apparent shortcuts often turn out to be the longest way between 2 points. In wilderness travel, the most sustainable pace usually wins over aggressive time management." As they began hiking the Valley Trail toward Lake Crescent, the group continued processing lessons that extended far beyond outdoor recreation. The corporate team was beginning to recognize parallels between wilderness decision-making and business leadership that they hadn't anticipated. "In the office," Marcus reflected as they walked through old-growth forest, "we're always pushing for the direct approach, the shortest timeline, the most aggressive targets. But maybe we're missing something about sustainable strategies. Wilderness travel forces you to think in terms of risk management rather than just goal achievement," Sarah agreed. "You have to balance multiple variables simultaneously: weather, terrain, group capabilities, backup plans, resource management." Jennifer, whose ankle had recovered significantly in the stable trail conditions, added, "And you have to trust expertise even when it contradicts your own instincts or preferences." The trail wound through spectacular scenery that they had missed entirely in their original planning. Ancient cedars created cathedral-like spaces where morning light filtered through multiple canopy layers. Creek crossings revealed crystal-clear water running over granite bedrock, polished smooth by thousands of years of flow. "We never would have seen any of this on the Ridge route," Robert observed, filming the pristine wilderness around them. "Ridge trails offer panoramic views," Sarah explained, "but valley routes provide intimate access to ecosystem details you can't observe from elevation. Different perspectives, different rewards." As they hiked, Sarah continued sharing wilderness wisdom that revealed the depth of knowledge required for safe backcountry travel. Navigation techniques that accounted for magnetic declination, seasonal variations in trail conditions, water purification methods for different sources, leave-no-trace camping principles, wildlife encounter protocols, and emergency signaling procedures. "How long does it take to develop this level of expertise?" David asked, after Sarah had identified edible plants and explained their traditional uses by indigenous peoples. "The technical certifications take about 2 years of intensive training," Sarah replied, "but the intuitive understanding that allows you to read weather patterns, assess group dynamics, and make judgment calls in uncertain situations, that takes years of field experience." Patricia made a connection that surprised everyone. "It's like the difference between knowing accounting principles and being able to analyze a complex business situation. The technical knowledge is just the foundation." "Exactly," Sarah agreed. "Anyone can learn to use a compass and read a topographic map, but knowing when to override the map based on current conditions, group capabilities, and risk factors, that's where experience becomes invaluable." They reached Lake Crescent 2 hours ahead of their original schedule, emerging from the forest trail to find their pickup point basking in afternoon sunshine. The storm system had moved inland, leaving behind crystal-clear air and dramatic cloud formations over the Olympic Mountains. As they waited for their transportation back to civilization, the group reflected on how completely their understanding had evolved over just 2 days. They had begun the expedition confident in their problem-solving abilities and skeptical of their guide's judgment. They were ending it with profound respect for expertise they hadn't recognized and humility about the limitations of their own knowledge. "Sarah," Marcus said as they sat by the lake shore, "I want to apologize again, but more specifically this time. We didn't just question your navigation skills, we dismissed your professional expertise based on our assumptions about what was important. And we could have paid a serious price for that arrogance," Jennifer added. "People actually were hurt on the route we insisted on taking." Sarah watched the last of the storm clouds disappearing over the mountain peaks. The wilderness has a way of teaching humility, sometimes gently, sometimes not so gently. You learned the lesson without having to experience the harsh consequences, which makes this a successful expedition in my book. David pulled out his digital compass one final time, comparing its reading to Sarah's traditional magnetic compass. Both now pointed in exactly the same direction. "I guess the question isn't whether the compass reading is right or wrong," he said. "The question is whether you trust the person interpreting what the compass is telling you." As their pickup vehicle appeared in the distance, the group understood that they had experienced something far more valuable than a typical corporate retreat. They had learned to recognize expertise, respect professional judgment, and understand that sometimes the person who seems to be pointing you in the wrong direction is actually the one trying to save your life. The compass had never been wrong. They had simply needed to learn how to read it correctly. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson found himself standing in the executive conference room of Henderson Tech Solutions, facing a crisis that would reshape how he approached leadership decisions for the rest of his career. The quarterly board meeting had just concluded with devastating news. Their primary software client, representing 40% of company revenue, was threatening to terminate their contract due to what they called fundamental failures in project management and risk assessment. The client's complaints centered around Henderson Tech's insistence on rushing a critical system upgrade through the shortest possible timeline, ignoring warnings from their senior developers about potential integration problems. The aggressive schedule had seemed efficient and cost-effective in planning meetings. In reality, it had led to cascading failures that brought down the client's entire customer service platform for 18 hours during their busiest sales period of the year. Marcus stared at the client termination notice, remembering another time when his preference for the direct route had nearly led to disaster. The parallels were unmistakable. Just as his team had dismissed Sarah's weather warnings and navigation expertise in the Olympic Peninsula, his company had overridden their senior developers' technical concerns in favor of what appeared to be a more efficient approach. "We need an emergency response plan," Jennifer Walsh announced, entering the conference room with a stack of crisis management documents. As marketing director, she was now facing the challenge of explaining to stakeholders why Henderson Tech had prioritized speed over stability in such a critical project. David Chen from IT followed close behind, his expression grim. "The technical post-mortem is complete. Every single issue our senior team flagged during the planning phase actually occurred. The integration problems, the database conflicts, the security vulnerabilities, all of it was predictable and preventable." Patricia Rodriguez set down a thick financial analysis folder. "The cost of fixing this mess is going to be approximately 4 times what we would have spent implementing the conservative timeline our development team originally proposed." It's like the difference between knowing accounting principles and being able to analyze a complex business situation. The technical knowledge is just the foundation. "Exactly," Sarah agreed. "Anyone can learn to use a compass and read a topographic map, but knowing when to override the map based on current conditions, group capabilities, and risk actors, that's where experience becomes invaluable." They reached Lake Crescent 2 hours ahead of their original schedule, emerging from the forest trail to find their pickup point basking in afternoon sunshine. The storm system had moved inland, leaving behind crystal clear air and dramatic cloud formations over the Olympic Mountains. As they waited for their transportation back to civilization, the group reflected on how completely their understanding had evolved over just 2 days. They had begun the expedition confident in their problem-solving abilities and skeptical of their guide's judgment. They were ending it with profound respect for expertise they hadn't recognized and humility about the limitations of their own knowledge. "Sarah," Marcus said as they sat by the lake shore, "I want to apologize again, but more specifically this time. We didn't just question your navigation skills, we dismissed your professional expertise based on our assumptions about what was important. And we could have paid a serious price for that arrogance," Jennifer added. Sarah watched the last of the storm clouds disappearing over the mountain peaks. The wilderness has a way of teaching humility, sometimes not so gently. You learned the lesson without having to experience the harsh consequences, which makes this a successful expedition in my book. David pulled out his digital compass one final time, comparing its reading to Sarah's traditional magnetic compass. Both now pointed in exactly the same direction. "I guess the question isn't whether the compass reading is right or wrong," he said. "The question is whether you trust the person interpreting what the compass is telling you." As their pickup vehicle appeared in the distance, the group understood that they had experienced something far more valuable than a typical corporate retreat. They had learned to recognize expertise, respect professional judgment, and understand that sometimes the person who seems to be pointing you in the wrong direction is actually the one trying to save your life. The compass had never been wrong. They had simply needed to learn how to read it correctly. Robert Kim, now serving as interim chief operations officer after a recent promotion, was documenting everything for the inevitable legal and insurance proceedings. The worst part is that our senior developers submitted formal written recommendations for a phased implementation approach. We have documentation showing that we chose to override expert technical judgment in favor of business timeline pressures. Marcus sat heavily in his chair, feeling the weight of a leadership failure that had endangered not just company profits, but the livelihoods of everyone in the organization. The irony was crushing. Less than a year after learning to trust expert judgment in a wilderness setting, he had made exactly the same mistake in a corporate environment. "I need to tell you all something," Marcus said quietly. "This isn't the first time I've ignored expert advice in favor of what seemed like a more efficient approach." He began recounting the wilderness expedition, describing how their team had dismissed Sarah's professional weather assessment and navigation recommendations. Jennifer, David, Patricia, and Robert listened with growing recognition, remembering their own roles in that collective decision-making failure. "The difference," Marcus continued, "is that Sarah was able to redirect us to safety before we faced the full consequences of our mistake. Our software development team didn't have that same authority to override our business decisions." David nodded grimly. "Our senior developers are like wilderness guides. They have technical expertise that lets them see potential problems before they become disasters. But unlike Sarah, they don't have the authority to force us to follow safer routes when we choose efficiency over caution." Jennifer pulled up the client's detailed complaint letter on her tablet. "Listen to this. Henderson Tech consistently prioritized arbitrary deadline targets over technical stability recommendations, despite repeated warnings from their own expert staff about foreseeable risks. Sound familiar?" Patricia was already running calculations on her laptop. "If we had followed the phased implementation timeline our developers recommended, the project would have taken 3 months longer but cost 60% less and eliminated all the integration problems that caused the system failure." Robert looked up from his documentation. "So, just like the valley route Sarah recommended would have been faster overall, despite seeming longer, the conservative development approach would have been more efficient despite seeming slower." The parallels were too precise to ignore. In both situations, they had faced expert recommendations that seemed to conflict with their goals. In both cases, they had chosen what appeared to be the direct path to success. And in both instances, their rejection of expert judgment had led them toward potential disaster. The question now, Marcus said, is whether we can apply what we learned in the wilderness to fix this business crisis. Over the following weeks, Henderson Tech implemented what they privately called the Sarah Mitchell Protocol, a decision-making framework based on their wilderness experience. When facing complex problems with significant stakes, they would identify the equivalent of weather signs that might indicate hidden risks. They established formal authority for technical experts to override business preferences when safety or stability was at stake. Most importantly, they learned to distinguish between apparent efficiency and sustainable effectiveness. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. Changing ingrained corporate culture required the same kind of humility and trust that had been necessary on the mountain trail. But the lessons from their wilderness experience provided a framework for rebuilding client relationships and internal processes. Jennifer led the client recovery effort by acknowledging their mistakes with the same directness Sarah had used when explaining wilderness navigation principles. Instead of making excuses or shifting blame, Henderson Tech provided detailed technical explanations of what had gone wrong and comprehensive plans for preventing similar failures. "We made the classic mistake of confusing speed with efficiency," Jennifer explained to their largest remaining client during a crucial retention meeting. "Our technical team provided expert guidance that we overrode for business reasons. We're implementing new protocols to ensure that never happens again." David restructured the entire development process to include mandatory technical review periods where senior developers could halt projects that posed unacceptable risks. The new system gave technical experts authority similar to what wilderness guides possessed, the ability to make unpopular decisions when safety was at stake. Patricia redesigned project cost analysis to include hidden route assessments, comprehensive evaluations of what could go wrong when choosing aggressive timelines over conservative approaches. Her new financial models accounted for the true cost of failures, not just the apparent savings of faster implementation. Robert looked up from his documentation. "So, just like the valley route Sarah recommended would have been faster overall despite seeming longer, the conservative development approach would have been more efficient despite seeming slower." The parallels were too precise to ignore. In both situations, they had faced expert recommendations that seemed to conflict with their goals. In both cases, they had chosen what appeared to be the direct path to success. And in both instances, their rejection of expert judgment had led them toward potential disaster. "The question now," Marcus said, "is whether we can apply what we learned in the wilderness to fix this business crisis." Over the following weeks, Henderson Tech implemented what they privately called the Sarah Mitchell Protocol, a decision-making framework based on their wilderness experience. When facing complex problems with significant stakes, they would identify the equivalent of weather signs that might indicate hidden risks. They established formal authority for technical experts to override business preferences when safety or stability was at stake. Most importantly, they learned to distinguish between apparent efficiency and sustainable effectiveness. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. Changing ingrained corporate culture required the same kind of humility and trust that had been necessary on the mountain trail. But the lessons from their wilderness experience provided a framework for rebuilding client relationships and internal processes. Jennifer led the client recovery effort by acknowledging their mistakes with the same directness Sarah had used when explaining wilderness navigation principles. Instead of making excuses or shifting blame, Henderson Tech provided detailed technical explanations of what had gone wrong and comprehensive plans for preventing similar failures. "We made the classic mistake of confusing speed with efficiency," Jennifer explained to their largest remaining client during a crucial retention meeting. "Our technical team provided expert guidance that we overrode for business reasons. We're implementing new protocols to ensure that never happens again." David restructured the entire development process to include mandatory technical review periods where senior developers could halt projects that posed unacceptable risks. The new system gave technical experts authority similar to what wilderness guides possessed, the ability to make unpopular decisions when safety was at stake.
Patricia redesigned project cost analysis to include hidden route assessments, comprehensive evaluations of what could go wrong when choosing aggressive timelines over conservative approaches. Her new financial models accounted for the true cost of failures, not just the apparent savings of faster implementation. Robert documented all these changes in formal policy updates, creating institutional knowledge that would prevent future teams from making the same navigation errors. His documentation emphasized the importance of recognizing and respecting expertise, even when it conflicts with preferred outcomes. The most significant change was in how Marcus approached leadership decisions. He began treating business challenges like wilderness navigation problems, where the shortest path between 2 points was rarely the safest or most effective route. He learned to ask different questions. What risks aren't we seeing? What expertise are we dismissing? What would happen if our assumptions are wrong? 3 months after implementing the Sarah Mitchell protocol, Henderson Tech not only retained their threatened client but secured 2 additional major contracts. Their reputation for reliability and technical excellence began attracting clients who had been burned by other companies that prioritized speed over stability. The breakthrough came when Patricia presented financial data showing that their new conservative approach was actually generating higher profits than their previous aggressive strategies. Just like the Valley route was faster despite being longer, sustainable development practices are more efficient despite appearing slower. Jennifer's marketing campaigns began highlighting Henderson Tech's commitment to expert-driven decision-making and sustainable project management. We learned that the person who seems to be taking you in the wrong direction might actually be the one trying to save your project, became an unofficial company motto. David's technical team reported dramatically improved morale and job satisfaction. Senior developers who had previously felt ignored and overruled now found their expertise valued and their recommendations implemented. The culture shift from top-down business decisions to collaborative, expert-driven planning transformed the entire organization. But the most profound change was personal. Marcus discovered that leadership wasn't about having all the answers or choosing the fastest path to goals. Effective leadership meant recognizing expertise, managing risks, and making decisions that prioritized long-term success over short-term appearances.
The lessons from a stormy mountain trail had become the foundation for a complete business transformation. The team that had once dismissed their guide's compass reading as wrong had learned to navigate by different principles entirely. They understood now that sometimes the most important skill wasn't reading the compass yourself, it was knowing when to trust someone who could read it better than you could. The wilderness had taught them that expertise matters, that sustainable paths beat aggressive shortcuts, and that the person pointing you away from your preferred direction might be the one trying to save your life. In the corporate world, those same principles had saved their company. 6 months after nearly getting lost on a mountain ridge, Henderson Tech had found its true direction, and it had nothing to do with taking the shortest route to their destination. 2 years after the wilderness expedition that changed everything, Sarah Mitchell received an unexpected phone call that would test whether the lessons from that stormy mountain experience had truly taken root. The caller was Dr. Elena Vasquez, Chief Medical Officer at Pacific Northwest General Hospital, and she had a proposal that seemed impossible. "Sarah, I need your help with something that has nothing to do with wilderness guiding," Dr. Vasquez began. "We're facing a crisis in our emergency department, and frankly, we think you might be the only person who can solve it." The hospital was struggling with what administrators called efficiency optimization failures. Despite implementing multiple consulting firm recommendations designed to streamline emergency room operations, patient wait times had increased, staff burnout was at dangerous levels, and medical errors were occurring with alarming frequency. The harder they pushed for faster patient throughput, the worse every metric became. "We've tried everything the business consultants suggested," Dr. Vasquez continued. "Aggressive scheduling protocols, streamlined triage procedures, faster diagnostic timelines, but experienced doctors and nurses keep telling us we're creating dangerous conditions. Sound familiar?" Sarah immediately recognized the pattern. "You're trying to force the direct route when the terrain requires a different approach." Exactly. Marcus Thompson recommended you after Henderson text transformation. He said you might understand how to balance efficiency demands with expert professional judgment. Sarah agreed to visit the hospital as an organizational consultant, curious to see whether wilderness navigation principles could apply to healthcare crisis management. What she discovered was a perfect parallel to the corporate team that had once dismissed her compass readings. The emergency department was in chaos. Administrative pressure to reduce average patient processing time had led to protocols that prioritized speed over thorough assessment. Experienced physicians who recommended additional diagnostic time for complex cases were being overruled by efficiency metrics. Veteran nurses who identified potential complications were being told to follow standardized procedures rather than clinical intuition. Dr. Michael Reeves, the senior emergency physician, approached Sarah during his first day observing operations. "They want us to treat emergency medicine like an assembly line," he said quietly. "But patients aren't manufactured products. Complex cases require time and experience to navigate safely." Sarah recognized Dr. Reeves as the hospital equivalent of herself on that mountain trail, an expert whose professional judgment was being dismissed in favor of apparently more efficient approaches. The administration's efficiency protocols were like the corporate team's insistence on the ridge route, logical in theory, potentially catastrophic in practice. "What happens when you override the efficiency protocols for patient safety?" Sarah asked. "We get written up for non-compliance with productivity standards," Dr. Reeves replied. "There's no formal authority for medical judgment to trump administrative efficiency requirements. It's exactly backwards from how emergency medicine should work." Sarah spent 3 days shadowing different shifts, documenting patterns that revealed the fundamental problem. The hospital administration, like her former wilderness clients, was confusing activity with accomplishment, speed with effectiveness, and compliance with competence. The breakthrough came when Sarah witnessed a near-catastrophic case that illustrated everything wrong with the current system. A middle-aged construction worker arrived with chest pain that appeared to be a routine cardiac screening case according to standardized triage protocols. The efficiency guidelines called for rapid diagnostic processing and discharge within 2 hours if initial tests were negative. Dr. Reeves, however, noticed subtle signs that didn't fit the standard pattern. The patient's description of his symptoms, combined with his work history and family medical background, suggested potential complications that wouldn't show up in initial screening tests. Following his clinical experience, Dr. Reeves wanted additional diagnostic time and specialized consultation. The administration's efficiency protocols demanded immediate processing. The standardized guidelines indicated the patient was low risk and should be moved through the system quickly to maintain throughput targets. Dr. Reeves faced the same dilemma Sarah had encountered on the mountain, expert judgment conflicting with preferred procedures. "This is exactly like the compass situation," Sarah realized, watching the tension unfold. Dr. Reeves sees warning signs that aren't visible to people focused on efficiency metrics, just like I saw weather patterns that weren't apparent to people focused on reaching their destination quickly. Dr. Reeves chose to follow his medical training rather than administrative preferences, ordering additional tests despite pressure to discharge the patient. 3 hours later, those tests revealed a rare cardiac condition that would have caused sudden death within days if left undiagnosed. The inefficient diagnostic approach had saved the patient's life. Sarah used this case as the foundation for presenting her findings to the hospital administration. "You're experiencing the same navigation problem my wilderness clients faced," she explained to the board of directors. "You're trying to force a direct route through complex terrain that requires expert judgment and flexible response capability." She proposed implementing what she called medical navigation protocols based on wilderness guiding principles. Senior physicians would receive authority similar to wilderness guides, the ability to override efficiency requirements when professional judgment indicated patient safety risks. Diagnostic procedures would be restructured to allow for alternative routes when standard protocols seemed insufficient for complex cases. The hospital's chief financial officer, predictably, objected to anything that might slow patient processing. "We can't afford to have doctors spending unlimited time on every case. There are productivity standards and financial realities to consider."
Sarah pulled out her weather radio, the same device she'd used to monitor storm conditions 2 years earlier. This radio gives me weather information, but it doesn't tell me what to do with that information. Experience and judgment turn data into decisions. Your efficiency metrics are like weather data, useful information but potentially dangerous if you let them override professional expertise.
Dr. Vasquez supported Sarah's recommendations, recognizing the parallels between wilderness survival and emergency medical care. Both required expert assessment of complex, rapidly changing conditions. Both demanded the authority to make unpopular decisions when safety was at stake. Both suffered when non-experts prioritized efficiency over sustainable effectiveness. The implementation process revealed how deeply the efficiency over expertise mindset had penetrated hospital operations. Nurses who had been following standardized protocols for months had to relearn how to trust their clinical instincts. Physicians who had been pressured to move faster had to remember that thorough assessment often prevented more serious problems later. Sarah worked with individual departments to identify their equivalent of weather signs, early indicators that cases might require more time and attention than standard protocols suggested. Emergency room staff learned to recognize when patient presentations didn't fit standard patterns, just as Sarah had learned to read atmospheric conditions that indicated developing storm systems. The transformation wasn't immediate. Administrative staff struggled with variable processing times that seemed to conflict with productivity goals. Some physicians had difficulty transitioning from rule-following to judgment-based decision-making after months of compliance pressure. The financial department worried about efficiency metrics that temporarily declined as staff adjusted to new protocols. But within 6 months, the results validated Sarah's approach completely. Medical errors decreased by 60%. Staff turnover dropped dramatically as experienced professionals felt their expertise was valued again. Patient satisfaction scores improved significantly, despite slightly longer average wait times. Most importantly, the number of cases requiring emergency readmission fell sharply as thorough initial assessments prevented misdiagnoses. The financial analysis proved most surprising of all. Despite seeming less efficient, the new protocols actually reduced overall costs by preventing expensive complications, readmissions, and medical error settlements. Just as the Valley route had been faster, thorough medical assessment was more cost-effective despite taking more time initially. Dr. Reeves became the department's unofficial expert on applying wilderness navigation principles to emergency medicine. Sarah taught us that the shortest path between patient arrival and discharge isn't necessarily the safest or most effective route, he explained to visiting medical students. Sometimes the person who seems to be slowing down your process is actually trying to save your patient's life. The success at Pacific Northwest General attracted attention from other hospitals facing similar efficiency versus expertise conflicts. Sarah found herself consulting with medical facilities across the region, teaching healthcare administrators the same lessons she had learned about trusting professional judgment and recognizing when apparent shortcuts led to dangerous territory. The most profound validation came when the hospital received recognition from the State Medical Board for excellence in emergency care protocols. The award citation specifically mentioned their innovative approach to balancing efficiency requirements with clinical expertise, the same balance Sarah had tried to maintain between her clients' preferences and wilderness safety requirements. The ironic thing, Dr. Vasquez reflected during the award ceremony, is that we hired consultants to teach us efficiency, and it took a wilderness guide to teach us effectiveness. Sarah showed us that the fastest way through complex medical terrain isn't the direct route, it's the route guided by experience and judgment. As Sarah watched the emergency department operating under the new protocols, she realized that the compass lessons from that stormy mountain experience had applications far beyond wilderness navigation. Whether in corporate boardrooms or hospital emergency departments, the fundamental principle remained the same. Sometimes the person who seems to be pointing you in the wrong direction is actually the one trying to save your life. The compass reading had never been wrong. It had just taken time for everyone else to learn how to interpret what it was telling them. 5 years after that storm on the Olympic Peninsula, Sarah Mitchell stood before an audience of 500 business leaders, medical professionals, and government officials at the Pacific Northwest Leadership Summit. She was about to deliver the keynote address that would crystallize everything learned from a simple compass reading that had saved more lives than anyone initially realized. The invitation to speak had come from an unexpected source, the National Emergency Management Agency. NEMA had been studying organizational failures that led to preventable disasters, and Sarah's work across multiple industries had caught their attention. They wanted her to address a fundamental question that had emerged from their research. Why do intelligent, well-intentioned people consistently ignore expert warnings until it's too late? 3 days ago, Sarah began, standing at the podium without notes, a commercial airline pilot was forced to override passenger demands and flight schedule pressure to divert from a planned route due to unexpected weather conditions. The passengers complained about delays, the airline worried about costs, and social media exploded with criticism about unnecessary caution. She clicked to the first slide, showing news footage of the diverted flight landing safely while their original route was hit by severe turbulence that hospitalized 6 people on other aircraft that hadn't changed course. The pilot's name is Captain Lisa Chen. She's been flying for 18 years, and she made a navigation decision that probably saved lives. But in that moment, she faced the same challenge I encounter every time I guide people through wilderness terrain: convincing non-experts to trust expert judgment when it conflicts with their preferences. The audience included several people who had directly experienced Sarah's compass lessons. Marcus Thompson and his Henderson Tech team occupied the front row, having transformed their company into an industry leader by applying wilderness navigation principles to business strategy. Dr. Elena Vasquez represented Pacific Northwest General, where medical navigation protocols had reduced emergency room errors by 70%. Even Captain Chen was present, having requested to attend after learning about Sarah's work. 5 years ago, Sarah continued, I tried to guide a corporate team away from a dangerous route through mountain terrain. They accused me of reading my compass wrong because my recommended direction didn't match their preferred destination. What happened next taught all of us something fundamental about expertise, trust, and the difference between being efficient and being effective. Instead of retelling the familiar story, Sarah used it as a launching point for exploring why similar patterns occurred across every industry and organization she'd encountered. Her research had revealed that the compass incident represented a universal human tendency to dismiss expert warnings when they conflicted with desired outcomes. Dr. Vasquez, who's here tonight, discovered that her hospital was making the same navigation errors in emergency medicine that my wilderness clients made on mountain trails. Marcus Thompson found identical patterns in software development. Captain Chen faces these decisions every time she flies. The specific terrain changes, but the fundamental challenge remains constant. Sarah introduced the concept of expertise-resistance syndrome, the documented tendency for organizations to override professional judgment when it seemed to conflict with efficiency, cost savings, or preferred timelines. Her analysis showed that this pattern preceded most preventable disasters, from corporate failures to medical errors to transportation accidents. The Challenger space shuttle disaster happened because engineer safety concerns were overruled by schedule pressures. The 2008 financial crisis occurred partly because risk management experts were ignored in favor of short-term profit goals. The COVID-19 pandemic's impact was worsened when public health expertise was dismissed for political and economic reasons. The presentation revealed research showing that organizations following wilderness navigation principles, trusting expert judgment, planning for worst-case scenarios, maintaining multiple alternative routes, significantly outperformed those that prioritized direct path efficiency. The data was overwhelming. Sustainable success required the same kind of careful navigation that kept people alive in dangerous terrain. Dr. Vasquez took the stage for a panel discussion, describing how medical navigation protocols had spread to 17 hospitals across 3 states. Sarah taught us that emergency medicine is wilderness navigation under pressure, she explained. Complex cases require the same kind of expert assessment that Sarah provides in mountain terrain. When we stopped forcing standardized routes through every situation, our outcomes improved dramatically. Marcus shared Henderson Tech's transformation story, emphasizing how wilderness lessons had created competitive advantages they never anticipated. We learned that the companies rushing toward the shortest route to market success were often heading into business disasters. The sustainable path might look longer initially, but it gets you where you want to go safely and efficiently. Captain Chen described aviation applications of wilderness navigation principles. Every flight involves constantly changing conditions that require expert assessment and route modifications. Passengers see course changes as inefficiency, but pilots understand that flexibility and safety margins are what make aviation remarkably safe despite complex conditions. The evening's most powerful moment came when Sarah introduced Dr. James Harrison, a cardiac surgeon who had used wilderness navigation principles to revolutionize surgical decision-making at his hospital. Dr. Harrison described a case where traditional surgical protocols called for immediate aggressive intervention, but his experience suggested a more conservative approach would be safer for the patient. "I remembered Sarah's compass story," Dr. Harrison said. "Sometimes the expert who seems to be avoiding the direct approach is actually navigating around hidden dangers. I chose the longer surgical route, and post-operative analysis showed that the aggressive approach would have caused complications that could have been fatal." As the summit progressed, attendees shared their own examples of applying compass navigation principles across diverse fields. Teachers described classroom management strategies based on reading student behavior patterns rather than following rigid curriculum schedules. Urban planners talked about infrastructure development that accounted for environmental expertise rather than just cost optimization. Even military officers discussed tactical applications of sustainable strategy over aggressive direct action. The final presentation session focused on implementation frameworks that organizations could adopt immediately. Sarah had developed assessment tools that helped identify when groups were exhibiting expertise resistance patterns. The frameworks included protocols for giving experts override authority in safety-critical situations, just as wilderness guides possessed emergency decision-making power. "The most important skill isn't learning to read the compass yourself," Sarah concluded as the summit drew to a close. "It's learning to recognize when someone else can read it better than you can and having the wisdom to trust their guidance even when it takes you away from where you thought you wanted to go." During the networking reception that followed, Sarah was approached by Dr. Margaret Foster from the Centers for Disease Control. "We've been studying pandemic response failures," Dr. Foster said. "Every pattern you described tonight showed up in our analysis of why expert warnings were ignored during health emergencies. Would you consider consulting on national emergency preparedness protocols?" The conversation was interrupted by a young woman who introduced herself as Amanda Rivers, a recent graduate student in organizational psychology. "Professor Mitchell," she said, "I've been studying your work for my doctoral dissertation. I want to understand how wilderness navigation principles could be taught in business schools and medical schools as core leadership competencies." Sarah smiled at being called professor, though she had no formal academic credentials. "What's your research showing so far?" Amanda pulled out her tablet, showing preliminary data from her studies. Students who learned compass navigation principles before entering professional programs demonstrate significantly better judgment in crisis simulations. They're more likely to trust expert advice, less likely to rush toward apparent shortcuts, and better at recognizing when their preferred routes might be dangerous. As the evening ended, Sarah reflected on how far the compass lessons had traveled from that stormy mountain trail. The principles discovered during a simple wilderness expedition were now being applied to save lives in hospitals, improve business outcomes, enhance aviation safety, and potentially reform how professionals are trained across multiple disciplines. The most profound realization was that the compass reading hadn't been wrong just once. It was never wrong. Every time someone with expertise pointed toward a safer route, they were providing accurate navigation guidance. The challenge was helping everyone else learn to read the compass correctly. Marcus approached Sarah as she prepared to leave. "You know what's remarkable about all this?" he said, gesturing toward the summit participants who were still engaged in animated discussions about implementing navigation principles in their organizations. "What's that?" "None of this would have happened if we had just listened to you in the first place. Our stubbornness and overconfidence created the crisis that taught us everything we needed to know about trusting expertise."
Sarah laughed, remembering the frustration of that morning 5 years ago when her weather assessment and route recommendation had been dismissed as compass reading errors. Sometimes the best lessons come from the mistakes we almost make rather than the successes we achieve easily. As she drove home through the city lights, Sarah thought about all the compasses that were being read incorrectly every day. In boardrooms where financial experts warned about unsustainable practices, in research labs where scientists identify emerging threats, in hospitals where experienced nurses spotted potential complications, in schools where teachers recognized learning difficulties that standardized tests missed.
The compass was never wrong. People just needed to learn how to trust the experts who could read it properly. And sometimes it took getting lost in a storm to understand that the person pointing you away from your preferred destination was actually the one trying to save your life. 3 months after the summit, Sarah received a call that would demonstrate the global reach of the compass principles. The caller was Dr. Yuki Tanaka from the Tokyo Institute of Technology, who had watched recordings of Sarah's keynote presentation and recognized parallels to Japan's approach to disaster preparedness. Ms. Mitchell, Dr. Tanaka said through the translator, "We have been studying organizational failures that led to the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Your wilderness navigation principles explain why expert warnings were dismissed in favor of cost-efficiency measures. We would like to invite you to Japan to help restructure our national emergency protocols." The invitation led to Sarah's most challenging consulting assignment yet. The Fukushima incident had occurred because multiple layers of safety expertise were overridden by economic and political pressures. The same pattern Sarah had observed in every organization she'd worked with, but with consequences that affected millions of people. Working with Japanese emergency management officials, Sarah discovered that the nuclear facility's safety engineers had repeatedly recommended additional protective measures that were deemed unnecessarily expensive by administrators focused on operational efficiency. The earthquake and tsunami that caused the disaster had been within the parameters that safety experts had warned about, but outside the parameters that economic models had considered acceptable to prepare for. "It's the ridge route problem on a massive scale," Sarah explained to the international panel of nuclear safety experts who gathered in Tokyo. "When you prioritize the direct path to economic goals over expert safety recommendations, you're essentially choosing the exposed ridge during storm season." The Japanese implementation of wilderness navigation principles required cultural adaptations that taught Sarah new lessons about leadership across different societies. Japanese decision-making traditionally emphasized consensus building, but the compass principles required clear authority for experts to override popular preferences when safety was at stake. Dr. Tanaka worked with Sarah to develop what they called expert override protocols, formal systems that gave technical specialists the authority to halt operations when their professional judgment indicated unacceptable risks, regardless of economic or political pressure. The protocols were modeled after Wilderness Guide authority, where safety concerns automatically trumped client preferences. The Tokyo project attracted attention from other nations dealing with similar expertise versus efficiency conflicts. Sarah found herself consulting with governments across Europe, South America, and Australia, helping them implement organizational structures that prioritized expert judgment in critical safety decisions. In Denmark, she worked with renewable energy planners who were rushing wind farm installations without adequate environmental impact assessment. The Danish approach had been efficient in meeting renewable energy targets, but marine biologists warned that the installation pace was causing ecosystem disruptions that could undermine long-term sustainability. "We were so focused on the destination, carbon neutrality, that we weren't paying attention to the route we were taking to get there," explained Dr. Lars Nielsen, the environmental scientist who had requested Sarah's consultation. Sarah helped the Danish team implement environmental navigation protocols that balanced renewable energy goals with ecological expertise. The new approach required longer timelines but resulted in wind farm installations that actually enhanced marine ecosystems rather than disrupting them. Within 2 years, Denmark's model became the international standard for sustainable renewable energy development.
The Australian project involved wildfire management systems that had been failing catastrophically despite massive government investments in firefighting technology and rapid response capabilities. Fire management experts had been recommending preventive strategies based on indigenous knowledge and ecological understanding, but these approaches were considered too slow and expensive compared to direct firefighting responses. Sarah spent 6 weeks in the Australian outback learning from Aboriginal fire management specialists who had been maintaining forest health for thousands of years, using techniques that seemed inefficient to modern emergency management systems. Their methods involved deliberate, controlled burning during specific seasons that prevented the massive wildfires that had been devastating communities. Indigenous fire management is wilderness navigation applied to landscape-scale ecosystem health, Sarah realized. These specialists read environmental science the same way I read weather patterns. They see dangers and opportunities that aren't apparent to people focused on immediate efficiency. Working with indigenous knowledge keepers and modern fire management agencies, Sarah helped develop integrated protocols that combine traditional ecological wisdom with contemporary emergency response capabilities. The approach required longer-term planning and appeared less efficient in budget meetings, but it dramatically reduced both the frequency and severity of catastrophic wildfires. The success of international implementations led to Sarah's most unexpected opportunity: consultation with the United Nations on global climate change response strategies. Climate scientists had been providing increasingly urgent warnings about the need for immediate action to prevent catastrophic environmental changes. But political and economic leaders consistently chose approaches that prioritized short-term economic stability over long-term environmental safety. The climate crisis is the ultimate compass-reading problem, Sarah told the UN Environmental Committee. Climate scientists are the wilderness guides of our planet, pointing towards routes that might seem economically inconvenient but are necessary for long-term survival. The question is whether global leadership will trust expert guidance or continue choosing apparently efficient paths that lead to dangerous terrain. The UN project involved developing international protocols for climate decision-making that gave scientific expertise formal authority in policy development. The framework established that when climate scientists identified critical tipping points or irreversible environmental risks, their recommendations would automatically trigger precautionary measures, regardless of short-term economic impacts.
During her UN presentation, Sarah introduced the concept of planetary navigation principles, decision-making frameworks based on wilderness survival strategies applied to global environmental challenges. The principles emphasized sustainable routes over direct approaches, expert judgment over popular preferences, and long-term safety over short-term efficiency. Every successful wilderness expedition requires trusting your guide even when the recommended route seems longer or more difficult than alternatives, Sarah explained to delegates from 193 countries. Global environmental survival requires the same trust in scientific expertise, even when recommended policies seem economically inconvenient. The presentation included case studies from every project Sarah had worked on, showing how wilderness navigation principles had prevented disasters and improved outcomes across industries, cultures, and scales of operation. From individual medical cases to national emergency preparedness, the patterns remained consistent. Organizations that trusted expert judgment outperformed those that prioritized apparent efficiency. The most powerful moment of the UN presentation came when Sarah introduced video testimony from people whose lives had been directly saved by compass navigation principles. Dr. Harrison's cardiac surgery patient described how the longer route surgical approach had prevented complications that would have been fatal. A software engineer from Henderson Tech explained how sustainable development practices had prevented system failures that could have affected millions of users. A wildfire survivor from Australia credited indigenous fire management techniques with saving her community. These aren't abstract theoretical principles, Sarah emphasized. These are practical survival strategies that work whether you're navigating mountain terrain, organizational challenges, or global environmental threats. The compass reading is never wrong. We just need to learn how to trust the people who can read it correctly. As Sarah's UN consultation concluded, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple weather assessment on a Pacific Northwest mountain trail. The corporate team that had once dismissed her compass reading as wrong had become advocates for expertise-based decision-making across multiple industries and international organizations. The storm that had threatened their lives 5 years earlier had ultimately catalyzed a global movement towards sustainable navigation principles that were now protecting millions of people. Climate scientists, medical professionals, safety engineers, indigenous knowledge keepers, and countless other experts were finally being heard because a small group of business executives had learned to trust their wilderness guide during a dangerous situation. The most profound realization was that the compass lessons would continue spreading long after Sarah's direct involvement ended. Organizations around the world were now training their own navigation specialists, people who understood how to read expert guidance and implement sustainable decision-making processes. The principles had become self-perpetuating, creating a global network of leaders who prioritized expertise over efficiency, safety over speed, and sustainable effectiveness over apparent shortcuts. 5 years later, that lesson was still spreading, one organization at a time, one life-saving decision at a time. The compass reading that had seemed wrong on a mountain trail had become the foundation for a new understanding of expertise, leadership, and the courage to trust professional judgment even when it challenged popular preferences. The storm that had nearly killed them had ultimately saved thousands of others, and it all started with learning to read a compass correctly. But now, people around the world were learning to read their own compasses, recognizing expertise in their fields, trusting professional judgment over convenient preferences, and understanding that sometimes the person pointing you away from your preferred destination is actually the one trying to save your life. The compass was never wrong. It just took time for the world to learn how to read it. As Sarah's international work expanded, she began documenting the psychological and cultural barriers that prevented organizations from trusting expert guidance. Her research revealed that expertise resistance wasn't just an organizational problem. It was a fundamental human cognitive bias that required specific strategies to overcome. Working with Dr. Amanda Rivers, whose doctoral research had evolved into a comprehensive study of decision-making under uncertainty, Sarah developed the Compass Recognition Training Program. The curriculum taught people how to identify genuine expertise, distinguish between confidence and competence, and overcome the natural tendency to dismiss guidance that conflicted with desired outcomes. The training program's first major test came when the pharmaceutical company Meridian Sciences approached Sarah for help with their drug development crisis. Meridian had been rushing promising treatments through clinical trials using accelerated timelines that ignored warnings from their senior researchers about inadequate safety testing protocols. Dr. Rachel Webb, Meridian's chief research officer, had been raising concerns about compressed testing schedules for months. "We're seeing patterns in preliminary data that suggest potential long-term side effects," she had warned the executive team. "These drugs might appear safe in short-term trials, but cause serious problems after extended use." The executive team, under pressure from investors and regulatory deadlines, had dismissed Dr. Webb's concerns as excessive caution that would delay breakthrough treatments reaching patients who need them. It was the same efficiency over expertise pattern Sarah had encountered everywhere, but with stakes that involved public health on a massive scale. Sarah worked with Meridian to implement pharmaceutical navigation protocols that gave research scientists override authority when safety data indicated potential risks. The new system required Dr. Webb and her team to present their concerns using wilderness navigation analogies that non-technical executives could understand. Rushing drug development is like forcing the ridge route during storm season. Short-term timelines might look efficient, but they can lead to catastrophic outcomes that affect thousands of people. The longer route through comprehensive testing is actually faster overall because it prevents the disasters that destroy companies and harm people.
The meridian transformation required 18 months to fully implement, but the results validated every aspect of Sarah's compass principles. Drugs developed under the new protocols showed dramatically better long-term safety profiles. Regulatory approval rates increased because submissions included more comprehensive data, and the company's reputation for reliability attracted partnerships with major medical institutions. Most importantly, the enhanced safety protocols identified serious side effects in 2 drugs that would have been approved under the previous accelerated system. Post-development analysis showed that these medications could have caused liver damage in elderly patients, a population that represented exactly the demographic the drugs were designed to help. Dr. Webb's compass reading saved us from creating the next pharmaceutical disaster, Meridian's CEO acknowledged during a medical industry conference. We thought we were being efficient, but we were actually heading toward lawsuits, regulatory sanctions, and patient harm that would have destroyed everything we'd worked to build.
The pharmaceutical success story attracted attention from the aerospace industry, where similar efficiency versus expertise conflicts were affecting spacecraft development programs. NASA approached Sarah after experiencing multiple project delays caused by engineering teams raising safety concerns that management initially dismissed as over-engineering problems. The Artemis lunar program had been experiencing cost overruns and timeline delays because systems engineers repeatedly identified potential failure modes that weren't accounted for in aggressive mission schedules. Program managers, under congressional pressure to demonstrate progress, had been pushing for faster development cycles that engineering teams considered inadequately tested. Sarah spent 3 months at NASA facilities observing the tension between political pressure for visible progress and engineering requirements for comprehensive testing. The dynamic was identical to every other organization she'd worked with. Non-technical decision-makers prioritizing apparent efficiency over expert safety assessments. Spacecraft engineering is wilderness guiding on an ultimate scale, Sarah explained to NASA administrators. When you're navigating through the vacuum of space with human lives at stake, there's no margin for error. Engineers who recommend additional testing aren't creating delays, they're preventing catastrophic failures that would set the entire program back by decades. Working with NASA's engineering teams, Sarah helped develop mission navigation protocols that formalized engineering authority to halt development when safety margins were inadequate. The protocols established that when systems engineers identified potential failure modes, their recommendations automatically triggered comprehensive analysis regardless of schedule pressure. The NASA implementation revealed new applications of compass principles in high-stakes technological development. Engineers learned to present their concerns using navigation analogies that helped non-technical managers understand why apparent shortcuts often led to more serious delays. Program managers developed appreciation for engineering expertise that had previously seemed like obstacle creation rather than problem solving. 6 months after implementing the navigation protocols, NASA's Artemis program achieved its first major milestone ahead of schedule because comprehensive upfront testing had prevented the cascading failures that typically derail aerospace projects. The engineering team's overcautious approach had actually accelerated progress by avoiding the disasters that forced expensive redesigns and timeline extensions. The aerospace success led to Sarah's most personally meaningful consulting opportunity, working with the International Rescue Committee to improve disaster response operations in conflict zones. Humanitarian workers had been facing impossible choices between rapid response demands and safety protocols that local security experts insisted were necessary for sustainable operations. Field coordinators with years of experience in dangerous regions repeatedly recommended security measures that seemed to slow relief operations, creating tension with headquarters staff focused on delivering aid as quickly as possible. The dynamic had led to several incidents where humanitarian workers were endangered because rapid deployment took precedence over local expertise about evolving security conditions. Sarah traveled to refugee camps in Jordan and Kenya, working alongside security specialists who understood regional threats the way she understood mountain weather patterns. These experts could read subtle signs of developing danger, changes in local behavior, shifting political dynamics, emerging conflict indicators that weren't apparent to people focused on immediate humanitarian needs. Local security experts are wilderness guides in human conflict terrain, Sarah realized. They see threats and opportunities that aren't visible to people whose expertise lies in logistics, medical care, or administrative coordination. Dismissing their guidance because it seems to slow operations is like ignoring weather warnings because they interfere with hiking schedules. The humanitarian navigation protocols Sarah developed established formal authority for regional security experts to modify or halt operations when their assessment indicated unacceptable risks. The system balanced urgent humanitarian needs with sustainable safety practices that enabled long-term effective operations. The implementation process required sensitive cultural negotiations because it involved giving local experts authority that had traditionally been reserved for international headquarters staff. Sarah worked with community leaders and security specialists to develop decision-making frameworks that respected both humanitarian urgency and regional expertise. Within a year, the International Rescue Committee's operations showed measurable improvements in both safety outcomes and operational effectiveness. Safety incidents decreased by 40%, while aid delivery actually increased because sustained operations were more efficient than repeated emergency evacuations and program restarts. Most significantly, the humanitarian navigation approach attracted collaboration from local organizations that had previously been reluctant to work with international agencies. Regional partners recognized that their expertise was valued and their guidance would be implemented, creating trust relationships that enhanced every aspect of relief operations. As Sarah reflected on the extraordinary range of applications for compass navigation principles, she realized that the lessons from that stormy mountain experience had evolved into something far more significant. They had become a comprehensive framework for organizational survival in an increasingly complex and dangerous world. Every industry, every culture, every scale of operation faced the same fundamental challenge: how to balance efficiency demands with expert guidance, how to distinguish between genuine expertise and confident opinions, and how to maintain sustainable effectiveness rather than pursuing apparent shortcuts that led to catastrophic failures. The compass reading that had seemed wrong 5 years ago had become the foundation for a new understanding of leadership, decision-making, and the courage required to trust professional judgment even when it challenged popular preferences or convenient assumptions. But most importantly, the lessons were now self-sustaining. Organizations around the world were training their own navigation specialists, developing their own expertise recognition systems, and creating cultures that value sustainable effectiveness over aggressive efficiency. The storm that had nearly destroyed one small corporate team had ultimately taught the world how to navigate safely through any kind of dangerous terrain. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.